all that is you're hearing that effect, but being sped up. And that's called cross modulation. When I'm creating things, I'll usually just start with the basic root note structure of it, whether it's like just straight up octaves of the bass playing a series of notes that resolve, and then I'll go back and then layer it until the point where it's like, how much do you want to layer it? Do you want it to be some big lush piece of very harmonious kind of choral kind of sound, which I like, so I tend to lean towards that a lot? Or do I want to take that whole big chorale that I've done and then split it up into just, I want a grinding bass doing that, and then this mid part of the chorus, and by chorus I don't mean effect. Chorus is in multitude of voices all playing different harmonies, like a Gregorian church choir would be. As I want, okay, you guys do this with this instrument, and then you guys do this with this instrument, or make the decision to say, look, just do it all at once, all you use with the same instrument kind of thing. It's all like style options at that point. It's like dress up Barbie. You got the cool outfit, but you just gotta mix and match it, or just give her a pair of shorts and send her on her merry way to the mall. The bass note is for me, it's the lowest note in the chord structure, right? It's this row of bottom notes. That's your key you're in. Now, whether you want to follow that same flat note pattern, in this case I did, but if you want to, break it up and then repeat some notes and all that stuff, honestly, that's how I do bass. It's the lowest common denominator root for the rest of everything else. You can always experiment with going up a fifth or a seventh. So let's actually try that. So let's shut our arpeggiator off, because sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. So if I go up a fifth, this is a seventh actually. No, it doesn't work. Sometimes it does, but I mean, you don't know if you don't try, right? And that's kind of my whole take on it. So the bass would be derived from that. So that's basically your bass frequency, where you're probably going to use another synth to do that kind of thing, in which case I tuned my kick drum to that root note and some of these other weird synth notes. And that's all the same chord, just being played in a different order. The one thing you kind of do have to be considerate of is your drums, because those are two conflicting frequencies. They're in the same realm, especially your kick drum. So your kick drum and your bass note are going to have some kind of phase conflict somewhere in there. So the two ways around it are, spacing your bass notes out in such a way that you're not really going to have a kick and a bass note at the same time. But if you absolutely must, make sure you're ducking the bass just enough to avoid the colliding frequencies that do phase cancellation and stuff like that. But that's like a whole book could be written on how to avoid, like phase cancellation and stuff like that. So those I know are my chords for the whole thing, bass included and all that. So if I wanted a lead out of that, I mean, I could arbitrarily go in. I just know this by experience and practice, and take maybe some of these mid notes, and then, or actually, you know what? Let's switch it up. Let's go there, and then this high one, and that one, and then maybe that middle one there. So I'm going to guess that shape is going to make a decent lead. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to duplicate this channel. I'm going to insert a new clip there. So it's going to be the same synth. there. So there I have some kind of, oh. Great. That's the same riff as Happy Birthday. It really is. Almost. Oh, it is. Wow, who knew? Okay, so now I could take an arpeggiation tool, and arpeggiators are like a dime a dozen. Every app will have one. What this is going to do is it's basically going to go through all the notes. So those are those two chords. And then all it's doing is it's just stepping through the notes in this way it's going up, so it's gonna, and you can go down, whatever the fuck, it's up to you. And then the rate of arpeggiation is going to be your time, and then your gate, the duration of the note, or you can go steps. And it's always fun to just try and go up a seventh every time, or sorry, I want one step, and then instead of going an octave up, I'm going to go a seventh or a fifth. Sevenths or fifths are king. So that's interesting. That's a seventh. Now, a straight octave would just be... Oops. That's a straight octave. And then a fifth, well, it might not work in this case, but... a fifth doesn't work here. A seventh kind of did at some parts, but a little bit of adjustment. Now, there's some things good about that, and there's some things bad about that, because it went up a seventh. And this is where I would do this kind of fix. This is an arpeggiator as well. This plugin we developed because Ableton's was really bad. So this is an arpeggiator too, but this arpeggiator works in a cycle where I can pick, which note I want it to play. So I know that it's just going to play that one note once kind of thing, and I'm going to switch my input to Cthulhu here, go on pre. Input, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so now it's just playing that one note. So I know that, let's say every third note I want to go up a seventh. So here I'll go to pitch, and I'll link the length because I'm a loser. And I'll go up to... That's a seventh. See, now that note's wrong, but that's okay. So what I'll end up doing is just recording that note data. So you can see the note data being fed in here with my big... It's also wrong. Also wrong. Okay, good enough. So now once I've shut that input off, and then I have my track back. So now I don't even need an arpeggiator now because it's printed the actual note data there. So those are the actual notes being played. Oh, fuck's sakes. All right, there we go. Now I can go ahead and... shit like that. But then it's all about your pattern, really. Just having the notes play out like that isn't very interesting. But for the sake of just demonstration, I mean, that's how I would generate a lead out of that melody, just kind of by going in here and then, either picking the top line or, some of the middle guys or whatever. I mean, it's all pretty haphazard with me until I find something that works. And if I were a keyboardist or a pianist, I would be saving a whole lot of time by, just being able to play it in or whatever. And sometimes I'll try that, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I just find myself more, as a non-musician, I find myself getting it done easier by taking pieces of the whole big like choral system, chordal thing that I do in the middle there, and just borrowing pieces out of that, putting it into different processes, or whether it's arpeggiators or other synths, or just leaving them as straight notes and then using plugins to handle that kind of thing. That's usually how you get away with doing a lead or an extra layer or something. This one's funny as I like this melody. And this is like a really good example of a melody that you just do not hear anywhere. And I like that kind of shit because you're like, what the fuck is going on here? I don't know what I'm gonna call it, but the working title is Cat Thruster. So you can see all my chord structure here, but it's all broken up and split up between multiple instruments. But it was all derived from single chords. Same with that lead. And you can tell actually that all these clips are called F chord because I literally copied the exact same chord across the chart and then switched it up with different notes and different instruments. It was all F. And then I had to variate it and then variate the lead. But I, of course, had to go in manually and change a few notes. But so this is kind of a chorus. And then after that, here's a change. Random harp sample that I found on the internet that I just detuned to have it fit in that key, and that's like part of the bells and whistles process. But again, this lead and this bass and this synth were all derived from a series of chords. So if I were to go into this synth and then see the MIDI data for that, just somewhere, it's all been broken up. And but I can guarantee you, and I think in this case, if you fold the notes, so only display the keys that are showing, and if I went back and basically sustained all the notes in this chord, I could tell you that, this was the chord I worked with. And then it went, to here. You know, I mean, it's all just derived from sustained chords, which is all fucking music is, really. They're all chord structures, but arranged in certain patterns and stuff like that. And then I took the bass of that note and played it in through this, and then added some like funky octave shit as bassists do, I guess. That's not even a real bass. It's a synth. Sounds like a bass. So I mean, that's kind of how I derive melodic structure out of chord progressions. Well, the crucial thing to know about synthesizers to make music is just that you have to understand that they're all the same more or less. Learning synths in general is just a good way to get you closer to being able to like, oh, I want a really humming bass drone in there, and you'll know that you need to low up a few saw waves or squares or something like that, and then put a filter, a low pass filter on it a bit, and then play low notes and that kind of stuff, maybe depending on how bright or dark you want the sound. You'll know that it's has all a lot to do with the filter coefficient, and because you'll know that, you'll know how to use any synth to get that kind of sound. I like hearing what synth they used and then hearing it and knowing in my mind, of how it was treated and processed to not sound like how it does when I just plug the thing directly in and monitor it and listen to it. More often than not, it's like, yep, I know what song that was on. I know what song that was on. I know what song was on. My favorite was and God bless them, a talented bunch of guys. But what was it? The Prodigy with Firestarter. They were big fans of this synth that came out. I of course didn't know this at the time, but I had found a Korg Prophecy a long time ago. One of these weird alien spaceship-looking things. It was kind of like at the time the holy grail of these new synth things. And a buddy of mine had one, so I go over to his place and check it out. And I'm like pressing some notes, changing some patches, and of course there's this one patch that just sounds amazing. And it's like this cool, like 8-bit arpeggiation kind of textural wash, and it was called Firestar, and it's like the second preset on the Korg thing, and then of course it's the opening like of the track Firestarter by the Prodigy. And I thought that was the most hilarious thing in the world, is they named the whole track after a preset which they used in the first thing of the thing, and that was kind of cool. But of course that gets abused a lot. So like guys will like author these synths or program patches or plugins and stuff like that, and then of course these artists go and they grab them, they hit the one note, and then there it is on the album, and then I think 80% of the population saying, wow, that's the coolest sound I've ever heard. And then there's always like the 10% within the 10% of the producer population just kind of rolling their eyes like, oh geez, like they didn't even do anything to it. The quickest way to learn, synthesis in general, is just, downloading some cheap as free or free, plugins and messing around with them. Let's see here. This is a good one here. So you're gonna have, this is just a straight up saw wave there with the filter all the way open. And then you can additive is me mixing in and out a square wave with it. That's a square, and then a sine wave, which is just a pure synthesizual waveform. And then of course you get triangles and noise. And then it's all about unison is just what I'm doing here is I'm just cranking up the number of voices and then detuning each voice out in the fan. So it's going to give you more of a lush sound because you have about, I think, 6 voices playing at a time there. And then they all get processed through into this filter. So the filter's either opening and closing on that. Now I'm just doing it manually, but then you can assign envelopes to do that. So the decay amount of that envelope, is set wide open. So it's going to take a long time for that to decay. But of course, the shorter I make that envelope, the the quicker the decay on the closing of the low pass filter. Now it's a low pass filter. Of course, there are different types of filters. So you have a band pass, which is gonna go. It's like a band, a frequency band that's just gonna sweep, as opposed to just closing off the high end, or cutting the high frequency out. And then there's the opposite of a low pass filter, which is a high pass filter. And then the resonance is the Q of the EQ. Basically, a filter is an EQ. So the resonance is just, you know, the peak of the Q that's at what frequency you're sliding it around on. So it's more pronounced on low pass filters. So that's more or less how they work. Now this is just basic additive synthesis. So that's one way to do things. Now in other synthesizers, of course, you could have multiple arrays of oscillators and then have certain oscillators cross feed and cross modulate other oscillators, giving you a whole variety of, you know, different like tonal things. But usually, more often than not, what kind of gives a sound its sound is something that you're putting on after it. So if you have that kind of sound and it's just, you know, you want to drive it a bit, then I mean, Ableton has an overdrive plugin in it. And then, of course, adjusting the filter, and then with like a high resonance peak in it, and it going into like an overdrive pedal is going to give you a really like squelchy sound. So there's like just limitless routing possibilities you can do with synthesizers. Envelopes and LFOs and VCAs and all that stuff are just basically extensions of, you know, how to internally control your synthesis. So if you take Serum, for example, to do the exact same thing, here I'm producing a saw wave by default. So here I have an envelope. I have 3 envelopes. They're all pretty blank right now, right? So envelope 1 by default in this plugin, or you could assign it otherwise, is just linked to the amplitude of the oscillator coming through. So an envelope is exactly what it sounds. It's something that envelopes the sound that you're trying to do, and then, you know, shapes it in such a way. So you can actually see on a graph here is like the amp of the VCA, which is this envelope. So you can shape it and add a tag time, that kind of thing. Now you could also take an envelope too and then assign it to, you know, controlling your filter or something. So now if I go to this envelope, now I've also got one controlling the amp of the signal, and now that one's doing the filter. Now in any synth, it's always going to have some kind of modulation matrix, where, you know, you could say, oh, envelope 2, I want it, this is the source, this is the amount, and this is the destination, and then there's auxiliary sources and all that stuff too. Some synths have it, some synths don't. The same applies for LFO, which just stands for low frequency oscillation, which is some, like, as you play a lower note, you know, your waves get bigger and longer over time, kind of thing. So they're really low frequency oscillations. But low frequency is like, you know, sub 30 hertz kind of stuff. So if I take an LFO and I assign it to, you know, the filter cutoff, it's I'll just disable this. Filter. Or let's crank it up. No. So what that is just a cycle oscillation. So this is in effect a sawtooth wave file. And then, of course, the higher the pitch of that oscillator, And now you're starting to get into cross modulation after you go like, you know, pretty fast. If I take the synth off at about 100 hertz, you could actually sort of produce it. You know, some really weird cross modulations. So that's that. In principle, I guess my signature sound was this Pluck kind of sound, right? Which was essentially, we'd have one saw oscillator going into a filter, but instead of one, I would take like 4 and then go into 2 filters and then kind of stereo spread the filters a bit just for a little stereo width, and then add an envelope that just controlled the decay of it. So I could probably do it in Serum really quickly. So when I play it, the synth's gonna play, you know, its initial program, which is just, you know, a straight saw, which is actually pretty close to what we want. So I'm gonna turn on a filter there. Okay, so then I'm gonna put a unison of 4, meaning there's 4 oscillators playing at the same time being detuned by this amount. So this is straight, and then as I start to detune it, the computer automatically, or the plugin automatically fans out the voices, and then you can set the blending. Now you could do this all with analog. It just takes like 10 minutes, you know, to do that kind of thing, because you gotta patch and route and all that stuff, and it you know, your synth starts to look like spaghetti and all that stuff by the time it gets to this point even. So but it's good exercise and it's fun to do in the analog world. But if you just want a quick rough draft of that sound, you could easily use a VST for that. So then now another thing we need to do is maybe take an LFO. You know, you could do an envelope for this, but just for simplicity's sakes, we'll take a low frequency oscillation, attach it to the filter cutoff. So you're gonna get that. But you want the rate to be an 1/8 note, so here you can just lock it to a BPM and good enough. And then here is your filter coefficient and then your envelope amount. Now it's not quite there, so it's like, I mean, within this plugin you can add a reverb, which basically means, well, okay, so after I'm coming out of that synth, I'm gonna go into a rack reverb or the Eventide or whatever effects pedal. So now that's just a built-in reverb that comes with the plugin. So and then I want a delay on that too, of like, you know, an 1/8 note as well. And then, you know, because it's a VST, I can always go back and say, oh, I don't want the reverb, or the delay's a bit much, or I want to change the delay. You know, that kind of stuff's like super quick and easy to do with VST plugins, but the sacrifice you're making there is the sound, you know? So you gotta pick and choose your battles, really. If it's a background thing that's, you know, just kind of adding into a mix, it's totally fine to do it this way or something like that, you know. But if it's a big feature element that's going to be soloed, then I tend to go, you know, use an external synth or some analog equipment for that kind of thing. The first bits of gear that I got were, you know, nothing glorious, nothing like much sought after or anything like that. But I think my first kind of cool piece of gear was a Roland MC303, which was, if anyone's familiar with that, it's like an old all-in-one kind of music making synth. It was really weird. It was like, looking back now, it was like the biggest joke of a thing if you were a serious musician at that time. But it was really handy to get my hands on, you know, a piece of equipment that I could learn inside and out, because a lot of the knowledge that I gained from just that one stupid little synth and its, you know, basic functions and stuff like that still apply with even the most high-end gear today and stuff like that, because that's what they were trying to emulate out of this little box and stuff like that. And the controls weren't all there, so you always had to do some menu diving and stuff like that, but, you know, you got really quick and fast at it and stuff like that. So having that said, you know, I learned the fundamentals of a cutoff frequency and resonance and envelopes, how they work and how they affect sounds, and different waveforms of audio, and all that still like just translates over to other synths. So when I got this beatbox, this MC303 thing with the synth, which is basically I just used it for the synth, I could then, you know, go to a music store and see all these other synths and then immediately dive in and know what parameters doing what and all that stuff. Basically, once you learn the basic food groups of synthesis, then there's no plugin, no synth that's just going to come in and completely mystify you, you know, because it's all the same principles. This is all very intimidating. I think, like, you know, 90% of people who don't know much about audio production, they come in the studio and see this wall or walls of, you know, just blinking lights and knobs and all this stuff, and get really, you know, kind of overwhelmed by the complex look of the thing. But it's actually really not complex at all. All this shit is no different than a VST. In fact, this is what VSTs are built off of, except these wires are basically replaced with on-off switches or toggle this or routing switches or mod matrices. The thing you should take away is, you know, this is called a modular synth, meaning that it's modular. Every one of these panels, some made by the same manufacturer, some made by other manufacturers, every one of these small little modules has a very specific purpose. So what you have is oscillators, or let's just say sound sources, and then modifiers. That's basically the two things that are kind of happening here. So I have one module that outputs a VCO, which is a voltage controlled oscillator. Voltage plays a huge role in modular synthesis, because voltage dictates the pitch of something or the amplitude of something depending on the voltage going in. And what I'm doing is I'm coming out of a VCO, which is a voltage-controlled oscillator. I'm coming into just a small mixer here, and I'm going directly out to a mixer that's going into the input of my computer. So what you're hearing there is just a saw wave from this one module, and then, you know, this knob's controlling the pitch. Now the quality, because it's an analog oscillator, the quality is inherently just going to be better than any digital synth. So that's not very exciting. So that's when you have to start with your patching. So instead of coming out, these wires are basically just controlling the signal flow of what have you, whether that's the voltage or the audio. So I'm going directly into a mixer, and we'll just say this is my computer's input, because ultimately it is. So instead of going into that, I want to go into a low-pass filter. So you could take any filter you like. Let's say this one here. So I'm going to take the output of that saw wave and then insert it into an audio input into that filter. I'm going to take the audio output of that filter and then go back to my output. So now I'm just going from here to there to there. You just follow the wires. So now I'm controlling the filter cutoff. So now I've added a little more kind of depth to that, well, not depth, but I have a parameter now that I can change. And of course, all these modules have, you know, different ways of doing things and different outputs. So what we're hearing with the filter open there is just a saw, but just like flicking a switch on a VST, I can change that from a saw to a sine wave, or to a pulse, or a pulse width, where you can modify things like pulse width. But just for argument's sake, let's say I want to use a sine, which is that kind of resolution between the high and the low. That range you're getting is an analog sound. So that you can't really replicate well with a VST to calculate that. So, of course, you can get way more complex than that. This is a group of 3 of the same modules, so I can take another sine wave out of one and then go into the frequency modulation input of another one. So let's take the mod index of this one and cross mod it, which I believe you... Right. So now I have a sine wave modulating another sine wave. So this is set to VCO. I could also set it as LFO. So you're going to get that kind of automation because this is the rate of the low frequency oscillation, and this is the pitch of the destination. And here's the amount if you want. Well, it should be. It's So this is now the amount of modulation. So with no amount, I can now have that as a parameter. And as I switch that, say if I want to go to VCO, you're going to get a weird kind of what's called frequency modulation. So I'm using this oscillator to modulate the frequency of this one. And all that is you're hearing that effect, but being sped up. And that's called cross modulation. So you can cross modulate a saw instead. Or, I don't know, but FM always sounds good with sines for whatever reason. We're still taking the output of this one and going into this filter here. So to say you want to automate something like that, then the patch gets a little more hairy, where you'll take what's known as an ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release, or you could have ADR, which is just attack, decay, and release without the sustain. But now we'll take the value of that envelope and go into the cutoff parameter, which is called control modulation, which also runs over voltage. So what I'm going to do here is I now need something to trigger that ADSR. So I have to take like a gate input to that ADSR, come from, I don't even know. It could be anything. It could be this guy, the Tempe. That's always fun. So now as this channel is blinking here, you can see that that voltage is being sent here and the gate is being turned on and off. Now, if I increase the amount of that and adjust some of these parameters, now you're getting the filter opening and closing for you. And of course, that's going on the rate of whatever that's pulsing at. Now you can sync that to another clock and all that stuff, and that's good and great. But there's just like so many limitless things you could do with modular system. So it's like, oh, I want a copy of that envelope to also trigger the pitch of my carrier wave. Or the sync of the second wave. Oh, actually, it's this one. So now we have this sum out going into the computer, but say I want to hit an effect module or something before I do that. I can take this output and go into a, geez, I don't even know. Maybe, what do I got? I thought I had a reverb around here somewhere. I don't. Okay, I got an echo phone. These are always fun. So I can take the output of all that, go into the input of a delay type unit. So I'm going to actually give it a little more gain because it's very quiet. So now what is happening is this is cross-modding that. That's going into a filter. The filter's being triggered by an envelope generator, and then it's all going into a mixer, into one channel. The mixer's coming out, going into a delay type unit, and then that delay type unit's going to my master out, which is going to my computer. So, you know, just lots of playing around you can do, and switching things out really isn't that big of a deal. It's like, I don't even like this oscillator, so I can... Just gonna adjust the dry wet there. Now, instead of taking that oscillator, I could just take a... They really need to make really long patch cables. I could take a different type of oscillator. So this is just a different sound source going into the filter now. I bypassed all this, and this is an analog control digital oscillator. So of course I still have my filter, and I can just open that up as I'm... And all these oscillators all have different types of, you know, synthesis methods. This is like a saw syncing with another saw. Now, well, that's kind of a cool sound. But how do you incorporate that into a sequence? Well, for computers, what you would do is you'd use a module like this, which is a MIDI to voltage converter, basically. So what it'll do is you could take a MIDI out of your computer, come into this, and then send it note data, and it'll send the corresponding pitch control voltage that you could use to control your pitch of that particular thing. So you could do it by hand, where but you really wanted a riff out of it. Now you could use an analog sequencer like this to shift input. Is that not going to work? Because it doesn't like that. That's a bummer. Oh, that does suck. I thought you could do that. I guess the voltage isn't high enough. Just use an LFO then. So I'm actually sending an audio pulse to this sequencer, and then as that pulse resets, it sends a gate to this this small like step sequencer. If I make it only like 3 steps there, every time that pulses, it's going to send a voltage spike to the sequencer to keep it going. Now, and if I wanted those to be notes on a keyboard, well, all I'd have to do is take the voltage output of that and then come into and then I'm adjusting the but I don't have sync, which is kind of cool because it's producing a kind of sound that's not synced. And then it's a matter of, you know, now the nature of these things is they're really hard to tune, and you're always going to get minor tuning variances if you wire it in such a way where it's not going to quantize pitches properly. So those aren't actual real notes, but they're approximated and they're really close, but that's going to give you a kind of sound that you can't replicate with a VST. Once you've kind of done that, then you just kind of decide on which effects you want to what kind of things you want to modify by hand, and while your track's recording, you just hit record on your workstation and then do a couple takes and see what sticks. So that's, I don't know, not a very organized patch, but kind of explains a bit about how these things work. The only bummer is this, I can't save this. Once I start unplugging these cables, I'll never, you know, I would never be able to recreate that, ever. No way. Not exactly like that. Maybe something close, maybe something that sounds like it, but you'll never be able to recreate it. And that's why I really like modular synthesis for making even just one shots, or like synth, one little synth blip that goes in there, because, you know, you won't hear that blip anywhere in the world. One song that I actually really extensively used a modular system on was my remix of Ice Age, which was How to Destroy Angels tracks. And what I had done is I had made a whole cacophony of one-shots and sequences of blips that I recorded into the computer and then cut up inside the computer and then, you know, made this really long, non-repetitive sounding, like glitchy drum synth type sound. That was a lot of, you know, just recording small elements from here. It wasn't all done in one take with some monster patch. It was a culmination of a whole bunch of like small, simple patches like this, where it's that patch while I'm explaining. If I wasn't explaining it, might only take me about 2 minutes to do, but you know, you do about 100, 150 of those and then record all the shots and then create your own library of modular blips and bloops. Then you can reference that library, go in, grab the audio data while you're sitting down at your DAW, and then pick and choose what you want to use, that kind of thing. So that was something I used on. Sometimes I'll go to the modular to recreate a synth lead or a top line or something, you know, with like 3 or 4 oscillators running in unison to create a good, you know, synthy square wave, saw wave like filtered thing. But more often than not, it's just more for adding, you know, bells and whistles and cool little things in your track, not so much as feature items like a kick drum you could make on a modular synth, like a good solid 808, no problem. It's just you know, a sine wave with the proper modulation and envelope control and transient design and all that stuff. But it sounds the same just using a sample for that kind of thing. So it's like I'd more lean towards using, like, you know, an 808 sample as opposed to trying to reinvent the wheel with a modular synth. You know, trying to get a familiar sound out of a modular kind of defeats the purpose of using a modular. You could spend hours upon hours of, you know, just kind of playing around with one of these things and not actually record anything. I tend to do that a lot, which is kind of cool, because then if there's something you need to do, like, you'll know how to do it quickly, or you know, you'll know the patch work that you need to do to achieve a certain type of effect. But these things are like hobby toys, really, like where you're not even recording any of the audio and you're just playing around with it, making interesting sounds. All the better if you're recording them. So like more often than not, I find myself, you know, just making crazy goofy patches with these things. You know, your options are literally limitless when it comes to, you know, creating really new original type sounds. And you can buy, you know, a modular synth about that big with maybe about 4 or 5 modules in it, kind of essentials, and you can do all sorts of creative things. I just like having all these options open, and I'm a hoarder and I like to collect and all that kind of thing. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is that what you just heard there was a pure can be analog saw wave. So I'm gonna take that analog saw wave, go into an analog filter, right? And what I'll do is I'll take a digital synth here. Let's see, like what? I don't know, anything will do it. Like massive or something, which is not analog. And I'll match that frequency with saw wave. So massive here consists of 3 oscillators and a modulation oscillator and all this stuff, but just for demo's sake, I'm going to use a single oscillator. So what I need to do is just match that note. If I can. Well, see, the analog one is slightly out of tune
because that's analog for you. I'm also going to change that envelope a bit. So we can actually hear it. Where's the voice envelope on it? Yeah, 4, there it is. So I got it close, and this is something I tend to do a lot with analog synths is, you have to reference your pitch to a digital synth because the digital synth will never be out of tune. So I'm gonna try my best to line up the pitch. Close enough. And the thing about analog is you don't necessarily want it precise because so this one is digital, and that's analog. So analog's giving it a little more warmth to it, even though I am running it through a low-pass filter, but the filter is wide open. But if I go direct out, oops. Let's get some volume down on it. So that's analog, and that's digital. Now, in a square wave, you're going to hear there's no filter being applied on this digital synth. It's actually bypassed. And it's pretty close because it's a saw. But when you start introducing things like filters, so say I put a low pass, a 4-pole low pass on that with no resonance. And you'll hear the way that. Now it's hard to A and B it at the same time, but the way that works with this filter is if I you're gonna get you'll hear things like this ringing in the resonance in an analog filter. But in a digital filter, it's unless it's being oversampled a ridiculous amount of times, you're not going to get that kind of resonance in a filter, like a digital filter. It's close, but it's steppy. You can actually hear the steps in it as you're turning the. So the analog, there's no amount of steps. It's infinite. But with digital, you're obviously locked into certain increments of values due to the interpolation of the filter or the oversampling amount, which is basically the more oversampling, the more divisions it'll have within, a filter step or an oscillator or something like that. That's what oversampling does. Some digital synths have oversampling that can come pretty close to recreating that to the point where, I wouldn't even be able to tell the difference, but then some don't and are just so obviously, blatantly digital that you can hear it a mile away. And this is another thing VSTs really choke at sometimes. This one, not so much, because it's actually well done, especially if you go to, in the options of this synth, is Steve's taken the time to do some really big oversampling, which is basically going to let you but as I reduce the sampling, that effect isn't going to be as good. And there are other synths that just absolutely suck at that kind of thing. And that's frequency modulation. So doing that with analog is actually a lot better, because then you can get really goofy with that kind of thing. Like, so what I was doing is I was just feeding a low oscillator to control a filter. What channel am I on again? 8. All right, sounds good. So if I go to 8, so there's my filter again. Now I could do that same thing with an analog synth. All I have to do is just patch the output of one oscillator into the input of that filter. It's the same thing. I was just clicking there and saying assign that LFO to this. Well, I can take that output and then go to the input of that other one, which is... So if I go down, that cycle is the pitch of this oscillator. So as I pitch this up, that's going to get faster and faster. But if I crank the range, like, that's analog, so there's no limit as to how quick you can do that. Well, past 20,000 hertz, which is, you couldn't hear anything after that anyway, but... So you wouldn't even notice it after that point, but... So that's just some of the sonic possibilities that, you know, are capable of using analog equipment, because you can get a certain type of sound out of Serum by doing that same kind of thing. So that same kind of routing, if I bypass the LFO on that and I just have my note again, then I want to say, oh, okay, I want this to be modulated by oscillator B. Just not quite the same, especially if I start changing the pitch. It's all locked to certain intervals. So if I FM from B, it's really accurate, which is sometimes not what you want. So you can hear that the frequency of that oscillator is super low. But I mean, it's super crazy precise, and you're not going to get those weird random effects, just by finding, a range. You have a certain digital range between, one note and the next, like over a semitone, it's like locked to a float, is what it's called. And in analog, there are no floats or integers or anything. It's just voltage level, which is, going to give you a more range of control, like an infinite range of control, actually, as opposed to, a finite range of control through digital. So actually here I have a recording of a few analog synths that I used in Snowcone. So that sound there is from an old Prophet 10, and you know, just the way when I take the effect off it here, I had some EQ and compressor, but the dry input, it's just a really warm analog oscillator that you can't get, you know, with a digital synth. So there's some like machine dirt in there. All sorts of weird, just the nature of analog stuff. Where's another one? Like that one too. So this has been treated as well, but it's an analog recording of an Oscar here. An Oscar is a synth that's like about as old as me. And because it's that old, there's a lot of cake and like dirt crap in the potentiometer for the filter control. So turning that knob and recording and listening to it live, it's going to induce a lot of that kind of grit. So you hear that hiss. That a computer can't calculate that kind of stuff, you know, and know to put it in. Yeah, you could sample a long hiss noise and include it into your VST and then just kind of mix it in with it, but it's not analog, it's digital. So then that weird detuning of the oscillator, it's like slightly out of tune. It's not an exact science with this thing, but it produces this kind of weirdness and out of tuneness and like more organic sounding, even though, yeah, it's electronic instrument, but a lot of variables, you know, are present because it's like, you know, it's just like if that thing's been sitting in a warehouse for 20 years, it's going to sound different, you know. And if you can, you know, find little bits and pieces of stuff like that and work it in your track, you know, it turns out like a cool little feature in here. So here I used it. You know, and it not only is it just, you know, it's got a certain sonic fidelity for it and it gives it that kind of mood, but it also gives me the satisfaction that I actually went and created that sound from this like stuff and have my hands on it and had some like tactile feedback on the filter opening and then hit stop on the record and then brought it into my DAW, into my project and then use that, you know. It's like, then I can say, hey, I didn't download that sound from somewhere and no one else will ever be able to use that. No one will ever be able to make that sound. I guarantee you that. Because no one, well, sure, maybe someone has an Oscar, right? But good luck trying to recreate that patch. And then even if you did, good luck getting it to sound in the exact same old shit condition that's in.